Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project. We're very happy to have you here for a presentation by William Robinson on global civil war, capitalism post-pandemic, which William will expound on at length in a few moments. So I'll just introduce him quickly. He's a distinguished professor of sociology and global studies and Latin American studies at UC Santa Barbara. He's written many books, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity, Into the Tempest, Essays on the New Global Capitalism, and the Global Police State. So William's going to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about the book and his presentation. So it's all yours, William.
Well, thank you so much to the Marxist Education Project and Fred for this invitation. It's great to be with you here today, my morning, your afternoon if you're on the East Coast. I'm gonna talk about this book, Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic. But first, I want to put it into a little bit of background context. I have been analyzing global capitalism for the last 25 years or so and writing about it. And then the 2008 global financial collapse happened, and I turned my attention at that point to global crisis, to the crisis of global capitalism. And that's a big underlying theme of this book. But so my first take on that was a book that Fred mentioned, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity, which came out in 2014. But as the 2010s moved on, I started focusing in my academic and also my political activity, in what I saw as several critical developments taking place in the midst of the crisis, which has not been resolved. And one is digitalization. So that's a big part of the story of what I'm going to talk about today, the new digital revolution underway. But the second also is, and so because I consider this book that we're talking about today part of this trilogy. In 2020, I published this book, The Global Police State, which I'll mention briefly. And then in 2021, I finished the book Global Civil War, which is sort of a response to Global Police State. But it didn't come out until just recently because of COVID. And then I just published the third book in this trilogy, titled Can Global Capitalism Endure? So I'm going to really talk about all three of these books, with a big focus on the Global Civil War book. And let me start by saying, while in the midst of the pandemic, I started thinking about an emerging post-pandemic capitalist paradigm, which is still being consolidated, which would involve for me five different elements. And the first, above all, is the digital revolution. We're seeing, it's already begun, a massive new round of restructuring and transformation of global capitalism based on the so-called fourth industrial revolution technologies. And during the pandemic, this transformation incredibly accelerated. These new technologies really were turbocharged during the pandemic and pushing forward this radical restructuring of global capitalism that is underway. We're seeing the rise of a new biopolitical regime. And what's happening here is we see a fusion of these new digital technologies which blur the lines between physical, digital, and biological worlds. And of course, this restructuring and this digital revolution is immersed in the existing power relations of global capitalism. So that's the first of these five things. The second is that the pandemic, but more generally, this digital restructuring of global capitalism is opening up enormous new possibilities for transnational capital to accumulate, to make unbelievable profits. And I'm going to discuss that. The third is that the digital transformation of global capitalism now underway has allowed the ruling groups to incredibly enhance systems of social control and discipline over the global working and popular classes. That is to enhance what I termed a global police state. And fourth, this digital restructuring underway is resulting in an acceleration of what was already unprecedented global inequalities that we've never seen before since we've had recorded records, including mass under and unemployment, the expansion of what I refer to as surplus humanity, increasing transition of work to precarious and on-demand labor, and we're seeing all around the world, I'm going to get into this, social disintegration and a breakdown of political authority. So that's the fourth. And the fifth, finally, is that the mass of humanity is not taking this laying down passively. On the contrary, a global revolt is underway. It really, the current round of global revolt maybe started in the late 1990s, early 21st century, when the juggernaut of capitalist globalization and neoliberalism really was challenged. But for me, the turning point in this global revolt is the 2008 financial collapse. And this revolt has been picking up steam, and never, even in the midst of the pandemic, was not put on hold at all. Hence the title of the book, Global Civil War, which just as well could be titled Global Class War. So with those five elements as background, I want to start by focusing on the crisis of global capitalism and say that we are in a multidimensional crisis which simply has no precedent. It's an economic or a structural crisis of overaccumulation dating back to 2008, and it has not been resolved in 14 years. In fact, it's getting worse. We're on the verge of a global recession right now, but I certainly think we're going to see much more than that. We're going to see another global financial collapse, which might greatly surpass what we saw in 2008. But it's also a political crisis of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. Third, it's also this massive social crisis, a crisis of what we can call social reproduction, of social disintegration, the collapse of whole communities. The vast majority of humanity is increasingly having mass struggles just in order to survive from one day to the next. And of course, the fourth dimension of this crisis is what makes it existential. The collapse, the climate crisis, and the pending collapse of the biosphere if we don't change course. So in the third book in this trilogy, Can Global Capitalism Endure? I'm asserting that it cannot, that the 21st century is the final century for capitalism, that the collapse of capitalism can be drawn out over decades. I'm not predicting it's about to collapse in the 2020s, maybe not in our lifetime, those of us in this talk, but it's not going to, the system cannot make it to the 21st century. There's going to be biospheric collapse and there's going to be social collapse. And the big question is, can we take down capitalism before capitalism takes down all of humanity and much life on the planet along with it? So what we can say here is that we're seeing the historical exhaustion of the conditions for capitalist renewal. We've entered uncharted territory. This is a crisis like no other. Now, having said that, we talk in radical political economy we can talk about three types of crises. One is cyclical. The mainstream economists call it the business cycle. Recessions. We see these recessions about once every 10 years. In fact, since we've had records in the 1830s right up to date, almost like clockwork, about once every 10 years there's a cyclical crisis or a recession. But the second type of crisis is the one that we are in now, a much more serious one, which we can call a structural crisis. I call it structural because the only way to resolve this crisis, and when I say resolve, I don't mean resolve for the mass of humanity, the global working and popular classes, but resolved for the system. The only way to resolve the structural crisis is to restructure capitalism, how it operates, and so forth. And so we see, I'm going to come back and discuss structural crises, but I'm suggesting to you that from 2008 and on, we're in the midst of a deep structural crisis. However, the third type of crisis we can call systemic, meaning that the only way to resolve this crisis is to actually move beyond the existing system, in this case, move beyond capitalism. And because of the ecological dimension and some other things I'm going to mention in the talk, I'm suggesting we're moving from a structural towards a systemic crisis. Now, let me say that the ruling classes all around the world have moved on to permanent crisis management. They're rudderless. They don't know how to resolve this crisis. Over the past 40 years, world capitalism has been driven forward by the triple processes of globalization, digitalization, and financialization. And this allowed an expansion of the system temporarily, but then brought it crashing down into crisis. And the big thing I want to emphasize here is the problem of surplus capital, what in technical terms we call an overaccumulation crisis, meaning that over the past 40 years of capitalist globalization and neoliberalism, what I call the transnational capitalist class has accumulated enormous amounts of wealth beyond what it can possibly reinvest or even spend. And this has created a situation where you have massive quantities of fictitious capital. What I mean by fictitious capital is capital which has no backing in the real economy of goods and services upon which we all depend and in which we all live. So I'm going to talk a little more about that in just a moment. This massive amount of fictitious capital that's been built up over 40 years, but especially since 2008, which is now destabilizing the whole global system. But I want to say here, and I want to say here, though, that the flip side to surplus capital, to this overaccumulation of capital by the transnational capitalist class, is a surplus of people. That is surplus humanity. And I'm going to elaborate on this in just a moment. But this means that the ruling groups have two challenges in the face of this unprecedented crisis that we face. The first challenge is, how do you resolve this situation of overaccumulation? How do you open up new possibilities for accumulating capital for profit making in the face of what's now chronic stagnation? But the other big challenge that the ruling groups face is how do you control the mass of humanity, which is in frank rebellion all over the world? There was the defeat worldwide of proletarian forces in the 1960s and 1970s, and then there was the triumph of globalized capitalism in the 80s and 90s, and this global revolt gets underway in the 21st century. But so I'm summarizing here, and then I'm going to start breaking some of this stuff down. But let me say also that the ruling groups are hoping that they can reactivate global capitalism, create what we can call a new regime of accumulation, a new round of expansion and prosperity based on these new digital technologies that I analyzed in detail in the book Global Civil War. But if that's going to happen, in other words, if capitalism will have a new lease of life for the next few years or decades, because this crisis will be drawn out, if that's going to happen through digital transformation, we're going to have radical restructuring and radical reform involving redistribution of wealth downward on a worldwide scale and a regulation of global markets and the global circuits of capital. And right now, we don't see that on the agenda at all. And so, meanwhile, we're seeing the violent crack up of the post-World War II international order. We're seeing a deepening crisis of hegemony in the international system. And our biggest danger may be now to avoid World War III. So, excuse me, I'm just getting over a flu. I got tested, and thankfully it wasn't COVID, but I might cough a bit. So I want to break some of this down and focus now on these different dimensions and go back to a little more detail on this structural crisis of global capitalism. So I was mentioning it's the second type of crisis. We see this occurring about every 40 to 50 years in the last 200 years of world capitalism. So we can say the first major structural crisis of world capitalism was from the end of the 1870s to the beginning of the 1890s. And the system got out of that structural crisis, that was the first Great Depression, by launching a new round of colonialism and imperialism. And of course, Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, etc., write about imperialism as the latest stage of capitalism. Then we get to the next big structural crisis, which is the 1930s, the next Great Depression. And the system got out of that, well, apart from World War II itself, it got out of that by forging a new type of capitalism, what technically we can call Fordist Keynesian capitalism, you can call it New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism, redistributive capitalism, regulated capitalism, whatever name we use for it. This is the type of capitalism that resolved the 1930s crisis and that led to this period of post-World War prosperity, the so-called golden age of capitalism, of world capitalism. And then we get to the next structural crisis, which was the 1970s, expressed as stagflation, chronic stagnation, along with inflation and all of the political and social instability that all of that involved. So the ruling groups or the system got out of this crisis of the 1970s by capital going global, launching capitalist globalization and neoliberalism, reverting the correlation of social and class forces that had been very favorable to the working and popular classes around the world through mass struggle in the 1960s and the early 1970s. And that led to this period of globalization. We saw a boom in the global economy in the 1980s and especially the 1990s. Profit rates were restored. The popular and working classes around the world were pushed onto the defensive, et cetera, et cetera. But then comes 2008. And that's the beginning of the next structural crisis. In fact, 45 to 50 years after the last giant structural crisis. And at the core of this structural crisis is, again, what we call technically overaccumulation, meaning that the capitalist classes, in this case the transnational capitalist class, that's the hegemonic fraction of capital on a world scale, has accumulated so much capital but it cannot profitably reinvest that capital, so chronic stagnation sets in. And to give you an indicator here, the 2,000 leading transnational corporations were sitting on cash reserves in 2010, which was 2 years after the 2008 collapse, of $6.6 trillion. And fast forward to 2020, they are sitting on cash reserves of $14.2 trillion. So this is a magnitude which is an indicator of the extent of stagnation, of capitalists just holding on to their massively accumulated capital because they can't profitably reinvest it. They don't know where to unload it. And $14.2 trillion, by the way, is more than the foreign exchange reserves of all the central banks in the world put together. So let me backtrack here and say that in the history of Marxism, we have always had, and crisis, when Marxists analyze crisis, we've always had this debate. Does crisis originate in the circuit of production, expressed as a decline in the rate of profit, or does it originate in the circuit of circulation of capital, expressed as a market relation known as overproduction and underconsumption? Now, that's a little technical. Some of you will be familiar with this debate and others not. But the important thing to know is that capitalists will not invest in the productive circuit if they don't think they can make good profits or get a good return. And by its very nature, capitalism places these pressures on the rate of profit, and you have a secular decline in profitability, in the rate of profit, unless it's offset by some other thing going on. And so in the post-World War II period, the average rate of profit was 15%. In the 1980s, that had dropped to 10%, and in 2017, it was just 6%. So you see this secular decline in the rate of profit. There was a momentary boom and recovery in the 1990s. That was the globalization boom. But the more the rate of profit declines, the more capitalists will not invest in the productive economy of goods and services. They'll look for something else. So what's going on here, of course, is both competition among capitalist groups, capitalist clusters, transnational capitalist clusters, and class struggle between capital and labor leads to, for the capitalist class, to increase what we call the organic composition of capital, meaning replace human labor, human workers, by machinery and by technology. Now, digitalization enters this story here in a big way, which I'll get to shortly. So that's going on in the circuit of production. But what's going on in the market here is that capitalism, by its very nature, generates incredible wealth, but polarizes that wealth. So growing inequality, social polarization, Marx spoke about the immiserization of the working masses. This social polarization, this inequality is intrinsic to capitalism itself. It's not something that comes from outside of the system. It can be offset by mass struggles which force redistribution. That's what happened after the 1930s. Capitalism was forced to redistribute wealth downward through New Deal capitalism. But once capital goes global, it's no longer compelled to redistribute downward. And so the natural tendency of capitalism to create unbelievable inequality and constantly widen that inequality is unleashed with no brakes put on it. And so you all know this data now, that by 2020, 1% of humanity controls 52% of the world's wealth. 20% of humanity, maybe those in this Zoom meeting, are at least able to survive. They can 1% plus 20% control 95% of the world's wealth. And then 80% of humanity, the vast majority of people on the planet, have to share just 5% of the planet's wealth. And so we see this incredible, unprecedented inequality. And we see from the 1980s and on an accelerated concentration and centralization of capital on an unprecedented scale in the hands of the transnational capitalist class. So we have this dictatorship in the literal sense of the transnational capitalist class, with that wealth and that power and that control over all of the resources and means of production of humanity. It can dictate what happens in global society. So the transnational capitalist class has put into place through globalization, digitalization, and financialization this new globally integrated system of production, finance, and services. Every country in the world has been often violently integrated into this new system. But here is the contradiction, because just like everything is driven by contradictions, that's the law of the dialectics, capitalism is chock full of all these contradictions. And so when you have the mass of humanity not able to consume, you have the global economy with the capacity to create all of this wealth, but the global market cannot absorb that wealth. So that is the other dimension of this severe crisis of global capitalism, the crisis of overaccumulation. And all of this has resulted in chronic stagnation. And the challenge of the ruling groups is, how do you and where do you unload all of this surplus accumulated capital? How do you keep the global economy sputtering forward in the face of chronic stagnation? So the ruling groups have had transnational capitalist class has had several mechanisms to keep accumulating capital, keep making profits, keep the economy moving forward, the global economy, in the face of overaccumulation. And they are reaching their end points. So I said that the historic conditions for the renewal of capitalism are becoming exhausted. The first is we've seen debt-driven growth. Consumers all around the world, very much here in the United States, but also worldwide, have accumulated more debt than ever before, consumer debt. And so you take out loans and you take out credit cards just in order to survive, to pay your bills and so forth. And consumer debt has reached its end limit. But there's also corporate debt, which is at an all-time high. And there's also government debt around the world, state debt at an all-time high. Global debt, for those of you who may be economists or have studied this, is approaching $300 trillion. We've never seen anything like it in the history of the world. So this debt cannot continue to push more debt-driven growth is no longer possible. The second big thing that's kept global economy moving forward is financial speculation. The whole global economy has been turned into a casino, a global casino. And I'll give you a data on that in just a minute. But there's limits to this financial speculation. I mean, we've already seen the cryptocurrency market collapse. Stock markets are collapsing because all of that is speculative activity. A third mechanism which has allowed the transnational capitalist class to continue making profits is what I call militarized accumulation. What I mean by that is that increasingly the whole global economy is dependent not just on state military spending, and of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a wonderful blessing for the military-industrial complex and for all those that accumulate capital on the basis of conflict and war. But it's not just military budgets, which are worldwide at an all-time high and are now spiking after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's also everything else, the construction of border walls, systems of mass incarceration, systems of state surveillance, localized civic conflicts, and political and social uprisings. All over the world, the transnational capitalist class is turning more and more to militarized accumulation, or what I also call accumulation by repression, just to continue making profits in the face of stagnation. That's a big theme of the first book in this trilogy, The Global Police State. And then finally, I want to turn here and go back to what I mentioned previously, this fictitious capital. So let me just throw out one piece of data and indicate to you just how unprecedented this is. Again, fictitious capital is when you print money, but that money is not backed by real goods and services in the real economy. So it's just money floating out there. We'll call it fiat money, which has no real backing in the material world. So in 2020, the global economy of goods and services, the real economy in which we all live, was valued worldwide at $75 trillion. speculation just in derivatives, nothing else but derivatives. Derivatives is a speculative instrument, reached $1 quadrillion. And that doesn't include all of the other speculation. So there's this unfathomable gap between the real economy of goods and services in which we live and this mass of money, of fictitious capital floating around. That's part of the financial instability and the crisis which is imminent now. That's a big part of the explanation here. The US government and the Western European governments and some others such as Japan, China, etc., adopted a policy after the financial collapse of 2008 called quantitative easing, meaning that in the case of the United States, the Fed simply printed money, delivered them to the banks, so the banks got incredibly wealthy off of them, and did so supposedly so the banks would recycle that money in the form of loans to productive investment to get the economy reactivated. But they did nothing of the sort because the rate of profit is so low. Instead, all of that money, and the Fed printed $16 trillion after 2008 in secret bailouts to the banks and corporations. And they simply took that money, the banks, and recycled them in financial speculation, escalating financial speculation with all of that money. Then the coronavirus came, and the US Fed, and along with the other big central banks of the big countries around the world, issued another $8 trillion without any backing. So the estimate here is that some $35 to $40 trillion have been simply thrown into the global economy without backing from 2008 to the present. So this is a financial time bomb which is destabilizing the whole system. And I want to conclude, and here I'm talking about the structural dimension of global crisis. I want to conclude by saying something about financialization. Many of you have certainly heard about, it's a term on everyone's lips these days, financialization. And I have to say that if I've asserted that the transnational capitalist class, this is a fraction of capitalist classes worldwide that don't belong to any one country, they've integrated across borders all around the world, they've interpenetrated, etc., so that they don't reside in any one country, don't have loyalty to any one country. The whole global economy is what they control and where they operate. And with the transnational capitalist class is the hegemonic fraction of capital on a world scale. And within that, it's transnational finance capital, right? So economists, by the way, I'm a sociologist, I'm not an economist, but even the best Marxist economists have not been able to fully grasp this phenomenon of financialization because it is novel and it is so profound and complex. But in a nutshell, what financialization is that you convert anything of value into a tradable or a marketable financial instrument. So the mortgage collapse of 2008 was, if 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, you bought a house, you got a loan from one bank, you paid that bank over 30 years, and that was it. But starting when you financialize these mortgages, you bundle literally millions of mortgages together into a package. The giant global financial conglomerates do that. And then you break them down into little saleable pieces. So everyone, investors all over the world, can buy a little piece of this bundled up 100 million mortgages, for instance. So you're financializing the mortgage. But everything now becomes financialized, including land, everything. And it allows for endless speculation. And it's allowed these giant asset management corporations such as BlackRock to be at the really core of the global economy. And the latest thing is what we call hedge cities. In all of the major cities of the world, I'm in Los Angeles, some of you are in New York, London, Tokyo, wherever you are in about the 20 or 30 leading cities of the world. Hedge cities are now that transnational finance capital is buying massively up property, just leaving it blank, land and houses and apartment buildings, simply as speculation. So they financialized housing. So this is, in a nutshell, this simply unprecedented worldwide crisis of over-accumulation, and it frames the other dimensions of the crisis. I want to conclude this part before I turn out to digitalization. By saying one other thing here, and it's that capitalism, by its very nature, the capitalist system, has to constantly expand. It's like riding a bicycle. If you stop pedaling your bicycle, the bicycle collapses. The same thing with capitalism. If it stops its outward expansion, it will collapse. And so there's two types of capitalist expansion. And again, you can never stop, capital can never stop expanding. That's why under capitalism, we cannot resolve the ecological crisis because capital has to expand. It's an imperative of the system. It has to constantly expand, so-called growth. Growth means the expansion, the expanded reproduction of capital. So there's two ways the system can expand. And one is what I call extensive enlargement, meaning expanding outward and conquering new territories, new countries, new peoples, and incorporating them into world capitalism. And that's been going on for over 500 years, but it's reaching its limits. There's no country which is now outside of global capitalism. There's very few pockets within countries around the world that are outside of global capitalism. So extensive expansion is reaching its limits. The world has now been conquered fully by capital. So the other type of expansion that capitalism can do to try and give itself a new lease on life, to continue to expand and accumulate, is what I call intensive enlargement or intensive expansion. And this means taking spheres of society that have been outside of the logic of capital accumulation, which have not been the logic of profit making, but some other social or some other local community logic, whatever it is, taking these spheres and commodifying them, turning them into spheres of capital, spaces of capital. So we see this radical drive, picking up steam right now, but going on for 40 years now, which is what typically we call privatization. You have to turn educational systems, whole schools and educational systems into private for-profit. That's intensive expansion, commodifying education. You have to take public healthcare systems, public infrastructure, public enterprises. We don't have many of them in the United States, but all around the world, there's massive public sectors. Even currently, space exploration is being privatized. Nature is now being privatized. Anything and everything that has not yet been commodified and privatized is in hothouse fashion now being turned into commodified. And so this is an intensive expansion which is beating down on us. It's resulting in a deeper social crisis, that crisis of social reproduction for all of humanity. But the key question here, and this is my segue now into digitalization. The key question here is, so if the system can't expand out extensively any longer, if it's in a deep crisis of overaccumulation, if we're on the verge of a global recession and probably something much worse, is there any possibility that global capitalism can experience a reactivation? Can it recover from all of this crisis and enter a new period of expansion, of profit making, and of prosperity, like we saw after World War II, a so-called new golden age of global capitalism, which again, not for the mass of working and poor people around the world, but for the capitalist system itself. And if that's going to happen, it's going to be through digitalization, these new digital technologies, through what we can call a new regime of accumulation, a productive reactivation rather than financial speculation. Based on these technologies. So this is what some people have called the second information age, or the fourth industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was based on steam powder. The second steam power. The second was based on mechanical power, on the engine and carbons. The third industrial revolution, using this fourth industrial revolution scheme, was based on the first generation of information technology, computer and information technology that came online really full scale in the 1980s and on. And so now we're at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. The first generation of information technologies allowed the ruling groups to launch capitalist globalization. Computer and information technology made it possible to set up a new globally integrated and globally coordinated system of production, finance, and services, and everything we've seen over the last 40 years. But now we're in the next generation of information technology. Here we're talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, the collection, processing, and analysis of massive amounts of data, robotization, 3D printing, autonomously driven land, air, and sea vehicles, virtual reality and augmented reality, new forms of energy storage just coming online, including cloud, and the new form of computing. It suddenly escaped my mind. Cloud computing and quantum computing, and so forth. All of and biotechnology and nanotechnology, so forth. So all of these new technologies are driven above all by data. And so by the time we get to where we are today, every person in every community on Earth, for the first time, is connected through a common digital network. So we're in a new ball game with this new digital revolution. And you might say that we've always had these technological changes, and that's absolutely true. And they're associated with the structural crises of every 40 to 50 years, which I mentioned, and then the system recovers. But I want to stress here that there's something different about this new digital technology because it involves machine learning. It involves complex communication, the algorithms driving the whole thing, and pattern recognition. So this means that it's not the same as the earlier technologies that constantly revolutionized capitalism. So we're going to see a situation, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now because we have discussion coming up, but we're going to see a situation where it's both professional work and manual work is going to become redundant. I'm sure you've heard all of this, the new machine age, the age of the robots, etc., that massive amounts of people are simply going to be redundant to global capitalism because they're replaced by this digital technology. Now, that's not inevitable, but that's where things are going currently. And of course, in my book, I lay out a lot of data on that. But so there's two types of labor we can see becoming redundant, replaced by robots, by machinery, by technology. The first is manual labor. And you might be surprised to know there are still, for instance, today, millions of mine workers in the mines around the world. But even mining, which you would think to be very labor intensive and not susceptible to technology, the amount of miners has been drastically curtailed in recent decades, and mining itself has become used more and more technology, information technology and machinery to replace human miners. In agriculture, this is what I discovered researching my book, The Global Civil War, that you would think agriculture, of course, is extremely labor intensive, especially picking the crops. And I'm in California, so we have one of the biggest world bread baskets here in central the Imperial Valley, central California. And of course, you know that there's millions of immigrants that come and pick the strawberries and the vegetables and so forth. But what happened, and then the same thing in bread baskets all around the world. What happened during the pandemic is that either seasonal immigrants, migrants could not move around because of the pandemic, or they didn't want to risk that. And so you had suddenly the threat of crops just rotting in the field, especially in 2020, early 2021, during the height of the COVID situation. And so both in California here and in Italy, new technology was introduced to pick the crops. In Italy, they have the giant wine industry, and the grapes were rotting in the field. So the agribusiness companies introduced machinery to pick the grapes. Because they couldn't get migrant workers. And the same thing was happening here. They've now introduced machines that pick strawberries, etc., in California. So this is just coming online, but even the most labor-intensive construction as well. 3D printing means that if 3D printing really starts spreading to construction sites, and that's already begun in select places around the world, you see a massive replacement of construction workers by technology. So on the one hand, you have this manual labor being massively reduced by these digital technologies. Now, I'm simplifying things here. It's a larger story, but that's not for this talk. That's for read the whole book and then also for questions and discussion afterwards. But then you have professional work. So in the first information revolution of the 1980s, when you had all of this, well, we had the traditional professional work, such as professors. I'm a professor, lawyers, accountants, librarians, engineers. But then you had all of this professional work, high-paid, high-skilled professional work associated with computer information technology, computer programmers, web designers, etc. So you have these professional workers, both old and new, and they're high-paid, high-skilled, and they are threatened also with replacement by technology. Well, we're talking by Zoom. And during the pandemic, teaching classes by Zoom came online. Even before the pandemic, 7 out of every 10 courses on universities in the United States were taught by adjunct faculty, not full-time positions, much less tenure track. And so adjunct faculty can teach all year long and has no health insurance, no vacation pay, no job stability, and literally makes starvation wages, literally. So that's professors. But then Zoom classes come online, and now universities and other educational systems can record Zoom lectures and simply repeat them and not have to hire and pay anyone. But again, this is in the book if you want to read the finer details. Librarians, accountants, lawyers, even doctors, some telemedicine now also means aspects of it are automated across the board, are threatened with being replaced by technology. So we're moving into a new situation where the ranks of surplus humanity and precarious labor is radically, radically expanding. So let me backtrack for a moment here. So let me just add that. So then, as I said at the beginning, the world capitalist system now is on the brink of this major new round of restructuring driven forward by these new technologies. And we want to remember that these new technologies are controlled by the transnational capitalist class, by the giant corporations and financial conglomerates that drive the global economy and that are the ruling class worldwide. And what happened here in the pandemic is that it turbocharged the introduction of these technologies. It gave an incredible boost to this digital transformation. And specifically, three clusters of capital came together, at least during the pandemic, to form this new power block of capital. One is the tech companies, which now are the giant tech companies, and not just in the U.S. You know the ones from the U.S., the big five: Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, etc. But there's also in China has giant conglomerates, India now, Europe, Japan, and so forth. So there's this block of tech capital around the world, extremely powerful, but they are glued at the seams to the military-industrial complex and the global police state and the Pentagon. And they are fundamentally interlaced with Wall Street, with the big global financial conglomerates. So you have this triangulation of a new block of powerful capital driving forward this digital restructuring and global police state. Right? If you want to put it metaphorically, you have a triangulation of Silicon Valley with the Pentagon with Wall Street. But here's the thing I want to, and so there's two things. The digital technology has the potential to reactivate global capitalism, get global capitalism out of its crisis, at least temporarily, not to the 22nd century, but maybe the next few years, the next couple of decades. But also this digital technology is an incredibly powerful instrument for mass social control and repression. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I want to backtrack here and say something else, that why is it that these structural crises are every 40 to 50 years? Well, they're part of the cycle of massive overaccumulation. Then there's a big bust and a big crisis, and then capitalism recovers again. That's part of the story. Another part of the story is that these long waves, if you want to call it that, in the world economy have always involved also new technological paradigms. So in the post-World War II long wave, you had automation and aviation and synthetic materials and so forth. And then the long wave of expansion after the crisis of the 1970s up until 2008 involved the first generation of computer information technology. So the question here, if we're going to get out of this crisis, can this digital restructure revert the relationship between finance and production? Meaning that we have stagnant production and financial speculation, which is totally out of control. Can we see a productive reactivation in a new period of rising prosperity? The key to that happening, which would get us out of this crisis, is you'd have to have a radical rise in productivity by introducing the digital technologies that rises much faster than any wages. And I want to say one other thing about digitalization. It's what we call a general purpose technology, meaning that electricity started to be introduced in the late 1800s. And it took several decades before it fully transformed the economy and social life more generally. But let me say something about the social control dimension before I move towards the conclusion, which of course is the global revolt, right? The global civil war, the global class war. So I want to just read to you one thing here, because again, these digital technologies, we're moving towards this biosecurity state. We're moving towards a much more intensified global police state. And if you don't study this, you have no idea to the extent which we are the extent of surveillance and the extent of control, which is covert. It's not If you're not aware of it, you're not aware of it. So this is during the pandemic, because the pandemic was this. We can say the pandemic was a dry run for the restructuring of global capitalism. It was also a dry run for these new systems of social control and repression. So this is I'm just going to read you a brief quote from The Economist. Now, you might know I read it every week. I have a subscription to it because you get the thinking of the transnational capitalist class and the neoliberal technocratic elite through The Economist. And on May 14, this was just this past May, they had an article titled Big Brotherly Boss. And they're talking about how when the pandemic hit and 40% of the global working population moved onto screens, to computer screens at home, this has opened up enormous new possibilities for social control and disciplining of the working class. So I'm just reading the brief excerpt from this article. Both the scope and the scale of corporate surveillance has ballooned. Global demand for employee spying software more than doubled between April 2019 and April 2020. Within weeks of the first lockdown in March 2020, search queries for monitoring tools rose more than 18-fold. Surveillance software makers' sales jumped. At Time Doctor, which records videos of user screens or periodically snaps photos to ensure that they are at the computer, they suddenly trebled in April 2020, while those at desk time more than quadrupled. The article goes on. Employers can follow every keystroke or mouse movement, gain access to webcams and microphones, scan emails for gossip, or take screenshots, leaving the surveilled worker none the wiser. Last year, Fujitsu, a Japanese technology group, unveiled artificial intelligence software, which promises to gauge employees' concentration based on their facial expression. And then the article goes on to note that 60% of corporate employers are now using such surveillance software on their workers, and another 17% are considering doing so. So that would be nearly 80% of corporate employers around the world are using this type of software. And it's not just for those of us that work in front of computers, whether it's high-skilled work, like a professor teaching a course through Zoom, or low-skilled work, like the computers that monitor everyone at the workplace, including in factories. So you can actually gauge a worker's emotion and the discipline or lack of discipline. So these are these frightening new systems of mass social control and surveillance. And it's what I was saying, that these technologies blur the lines between digital, biological, and physical worlds. So there's much more to say on that, but I want to turn now, by way of conclusion, to the global revolt. Let me start it, though, by saying that the system has this multidimensional crisis. We looked at the structural dimension, right? So I want to focus a bit here on the social dimension and on the political dimensions, because capitalist states around the world are facing crises of state legitimacy. And the capitalist system is facing a crisis of hegemony. I quoted in the book, I mentioned a number of surveys in the book, Global Civil War, the middle one of this trilogy of books that I've written. And one of the surveys was in the United States, and they interviewed generation, which is the millennial generation. And the millennial generation, 57% of millennials interviewed said that they want to move away from capitalism, that they're done with capitalism, and they're open to socialism. Now, that's a crisis of hegemony among the youth in the United States, and Generation Z was even higher. And I have the data in front of me, it's in the book, but it's like 60%. So older folk maybe came of age most likely in the golden age of capitalism, in the United States, at least here in the 1950s, post-World War II period, more conservative. But this young generation, which is in a war footing right now, a popular struggle war footing, and that's where our hope is, almost 60% don't want capitalism. That's a crisis of hegemony for the system. And then there's another survey conducted by, I think it was by Pew's, worldwide, that showed that more than half of humanity worldwide wants to move away from capitalism, believes that capitalism is doing more harm than good, and it's time to move to a new system. So this system is in a crisis of hegemony. Now, under other circumstances, that's great for us struggling from below to overthrow capitalism, for socialism, or whatever else you want to call it, post-capitalist society. But for the system, that's great if we can take advantage of that, if this global revolt can take advantage. But I certainly cannot find the data I have in front of me, but I want to say that the crisis of social reproduction, I want to say something about that, because what's happened is the more that the mass of people around the world become redundant and move into the ranks of surplus humanity, you have the global working and popular classes, which is the vast majority of humanity, and in several clusters. One cluster is surplus humanity. You're simply structurally unemployed. Of course, in the United States, that leads to systems of mass incarceration, to lock up surplus labor. I mean, there's endlessly we can talk about that. But I don't have the data in front of me. Again, this is just a brief talk, but I think there's something like 1.5 or 2 billion people are surplus humanity. They have to go to the informal sector, sell gum on the streets in Mexico City, or clean people's windshields, or find some way of surviving with no formal employment. That's surplus humanity, 2 billion people. But then the mass of those that actually have work, the majority moving more and more, are increasingly precariatized, meaning part-time work, temporary work, contract work, day labor, etc., etc. This unstable work arrangements, which I think I mentioned previously, on-demand labor. And so you have this massive crisis of social reproduction, and then you have to look at the levels of global inequality that I previously mentioned, with 20% of humanity controlling 95% of the world's wealth. But the pandemic comes along, and it radically accelerates and expands this inequality. I mean, this massive data, you've probably heard of some of that data, and I have it all in the book. But this came out, this article, after I finished writing the book. This is just earlier this year. Oxfam issues every January its Global Inequalities Report. The most recent one says that the 10 richest men doubled their fortunes in the pandemic, while the income of 99% of humanity falls. And it says new billionaires minted every 26 hours as inequality contributes to the death of one person every 4 seconds. The world's 10 richest men more than doubled their fortunes from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion at a rate of $15,000 per second, or $1.3 billion a day, during the first 2 years of a pandemic that has seen the income of 99% of humanity fall, and over 160 million more people forced into extreme poverty. Quote, if these 10 men were to lose 99.999% of their wealth tomorrow, they would still be richer than 99% of all the people on the planet. They now have 6 times more wealth than the poorest 3.1 million people. So this was already unprecedented global inequality, and it skyrocketed through the pandemic. And if digitalization proceeds forward in the way that we've analyzed here, global inequalities and this crisis of social reproduction will only get worse. So we're seeing these dramatic fissures and infighting within the ruling classes worldwide. Within the ruling classes, there is a reformist wing of what I call the transnational elite. There's also some among the transnational elite and the transnational capitalist class that are turning towards fascist forms of social control in the face of the global revolt. And these reformists have been putting forward a project to save capitalism from itself and to prevent revolution from below from overthrowing capitalism. So you see the reformist elite, especially clustered in the World Economic Forum. That's the cream of the global elite, and there's a big reformist agenda there, and including calls for a UBI, universal basic income. The G20 approved a couple years ago a 15% cross-border tax on cross-border capital transactions, but although it never went into effect. They're pushing forward a so-called green economy, pushing large-scale investment in infrastructure. I mean, you have the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but you have Biden's infrastructural bill and so forth. And we're seeing all around the world, maybe not in the United States or just a little bit with Biden, but all around the world we've seen the last few years sharp rises in social assistance programs. Now, this is not meaningful empowering redistribution, is simply giving out more social assistance. So this is this reform agenda. They also call it good governance, meaning they're trying to search for mechanisms for transnational coordination of economic policy so you can regulate this anarchic, out of control global market and global financial market. But this reform agenda has really not got significantly off the ground. And any reform agenda, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm going to conclude with the global revolt very soon. I'm very close to my conclusion. The reason I'm mentioning this is because if we are going to face another collapse, again, we're on the verge of a recession right now, and it's going to be worse. But if there's going to be a recovery and some new period of expansion and prosperity, it's going to come through the digital technology restructuring, digital restructuring that we've discussed, that raises productivity dramatically, along with, it would have to be coupled with this reform agenda by the transnational elite. To be clear, I'm not saying that we socialists should be fighting for the reform agenda. We should be fighting to overthrow capitalism. But mass pressure could push the elite to implement reform, which would give the system a new lease on life. I actually do have this data here. I thought I didn't have data in front of me on this crisis of social reproduction. 50% of humanity lives on less than $2.50 per day. 80% lives on less than $10 per day. 1 in 3 people on the planet as we speak today are malnourished. 1 billion go hungry every night. 2 billion face food insecurity. Refugees from climate emergencies, wars, economic and social collapse already number into the hundreds of millions. In fact, 450 million people on the planet today are migrant workers that have moved to get a job somewhere because they can't in their home country, or are refugees from wars and climate collapse, etc. That's 450 million. The United Nations calculates, one United Nations report calculates that by 2050, there will be over 1 billion climate refugees, just climate refugees. All of this means the ruling groups have to deal with massive social control, create a global police state, even a global fascism. All of this is possible scenarios because it all depends on social and class struggle worldwide. States face this crisis of legitimacy, and so they have to take internal tensions in their own countries, capitalist states, and try and externalize them, or externalize them towards scapegoats, such as the anti-immigrant campaigns in the United States, or the United States launching a new Cold War with Russia and China, even though those countries don't represent a threat to the United States, because you would externalize and make an external enemy to sublimate internal tensions of that crisis of state legitimacy. As I mentioned, we're seeing a breakdown of the post-World War II international order, rising tensions, we're seeing the end of Western domination of world capitalism, but not of world capitalism itself. There is no socialist challenge currently of significance to world capitalism. The center of the global economy is shifting, and the whole global system is shifting towards China, but within an integrated global economy, geopolitical multipolarity takes place within a single integrated global economy, and there'll be no withdrawal of any country or region from that global economy. So I conclude very, very briefly with this global revolt underway. I already mentioned the crisis of hegemony, but this global revolt has been sustained since 2008. You might remember shortly after 2008 was Occupy Wall Street and all these other movements in the United States, the Arab Spring, but all over the world in 2008 saw this mass global upsurge. You might think that it died down after 2011, 2012, but it didn't. According to the data, which I discuss in the book, it's incremented every single year. And then this global revolt reached a crescendo from 2017 to 2019. Think back to right before the pandemic, fall of 2019. You had several marches and mass, it's called the estallido social, the social explosion in Chile, with 1 million people taking to the streets, sustained protest. You had 3 general strikes in Colombia, each lasting weeks, the last one several months. General strikes involving millions of people in Colombia. You had the Sudanese revolution. You had uprisings in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Thailand. You had the Yellow Vest movement in France. In the United States, you had the George Floyd uprising, of course, but even before then, you had a wave of teacher strikes. There were 1,000 strikes, worker strikes, just in the first 6 months of the pandemic in the United States. So actually, here's some data from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has what it calls anti-government protest tracker. From 2018 to 2020, they registered 230 major uprisings around the world that overthrew some 30-odd governments. And then in India, to give you a concluding example, India in January 2019 had a general strike involving 150 million people. Now think about that. The largest single labor mobilization in history, 150 million people, is more than the population of most countries in the world. Then a year later, in the midst of the pandemic, 2020, going into early 2021, another general strike involving 250 million people. So the ruling groups are terrified. They're clamping down through a global police state, but this shows the global revolt underway, the global civil war, the global class war that we've entered into. I will just conclude. Maybe I've gone over time. I've definitely gone over time. I just looked at my watch. But I just conclude by saying we should discuss, as we move towards questions and discussion, the challenges facing the global revolt, because that's chapter 3 in my just 3 chapters in the book. It's a short book, The Global Civil War. But that final chapter, I identify 4 quandaries, 4 challenges to the global revolt. And I just want to mention the first, and I'll conclude with the first. We have this troubling situation between a mass revolt all around the world, but the lack of an organized left, a crisis in the organized institutional party left in most countries around the world. So you have this disjuncture between a proliferation of mass movements and popular uprisings and the lack of a socialist-oriented left that could serve as a rudder, that could agglomerate all of these different social movement struggles into a larger project of emancipation and push it towards a socialist challenge to transformative projects and socialist challenges. So that's something that we really need to confront. I mean, we are, but I want to point that out. Well, there's much more to say. I've noticed that I've gone on now for an hour. I was trying to do only 50 minutes, so I'll stop there for the moment, and we can continue discussing this.
Okay, William, thanks very much. We can now move to questions, comments. Our usual practice is for folks either to raise your hand in the Zoom screen using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or type the word stack in the chat window, and we will put you on the speaker stack. So the floor is open. Stuart, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, William, for dedicating so many decades to this difficult work of trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I really appreciate all the information that you synthesized to give us a picture of the situation that we're facing these days. It seems, I was particularly astounded by the statistics that you gave of the amount of debt right now, and with a crisis looming, it makes me think that we're going to see more and more governments in the world, and probably around the United States, North America, in the situation that we've seen in Puerto Rico and Michigan, where you have appointed control boards subverting democracy. And I wonder if you agree with that, and I wonder if you think that we're headed to a period where they're going to be using these tools of authoritarianism that you were talking about to try and do away with any democratic control and suck as much value out of the public realm as possible to deal with the crisis. And maybe you talk about that in the book on the police state, but it's just something that was on my mind that I wanted to get your reaction to.
Yeah, I mean, that's that's a fantastic question. It's really important for us to focus on that. And without any doubt, they could be called the Michigan Control Board. You can give them any name you want, but absolutely that the crisis allows, and you have to remember, of course, the quote, I forgot who was Obama's national security advisor, whatever it was, chief of staff, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, of course, the crisis allows the ruling groups to further erode any democratic accountability whatsoever and to do things such as control boards. But the larger story here, of course, is that well, several things going on, but one is that the sheer power, economic control by the transnational capitalist class means that even more than in the past, that's translated, that economic power is translated into political control, either indirectly or in this case with control boards directly. But we're seeing more generally here the privatization of the state. Remember, I was saying earlier that you're seeing privatization of public spheres, but setting up this control board, and very often, as you probably know, the people on these control boards are bankers, right? So you're basically privatizing the state, and you have around the world pushes for more and more of the state itself to be turned over to corporate capital to run the state. And the most blatant example of this is, I forgot the name of it now, but some of you might remember, in Honduras. Corporate cities, literally the previous Honduran government, which was brought to power by a coup backed by the United States, you all know that, set up a number of cities. They called them special economic zones. I think there's the technical words. Zonas speciales, I forgot, but in which literally the government in these towns and cities in Honduras was disappeared, the public government, no elections, and a corporation was allowed to come in and literally create a corporate government, create its own laws, its own rules. This, of course, is scandalous. The new government that came to power, Xiomara, gosh, my mind's going blank with the full name, Xiomara Castro, who is the president of Honduras, a left-oriented president, has rolled back that law. But absolutely, you have a situation where the debt is an instrument. It's an instrument that the ruling groups can use to impose discipline on workers, but also to much more heighten their control, and then once again also restructure finance, because I was discussing the many different ways in which the ruling groups managed to continue making money in the face of chronic stagnation. I mentioned a number of them, but one I did not mention is that this radical, and this is worldwide, remember we're talking about the United States, but worldwide, restructuring of public finance, of monetary and fiscal policy, and that's where state debt comes in. Let me state this. Governments borrow money in order to pay their bills, right? And government debt is at an all-time high. It's over $100 trillion worldwide. But you borrow money by issuing a bond. The U.S. government issues a bond to pay its bills, right? And then the bond has to be paid back with interest to the banks and the private investors. And where does that payback money come from? From taxing the global working classes, right? So it's basically government debt is a mechanism for transferring wealth from workers to capital, right? And so yes, the control board, and then when you have the massive government debt, capital comes in and even directly takes control. But there's one other thing I want to say here, and that is inflation. Right now we have very high inflation, highest inflation we've seen since the 1970s. And on the one hand, that represents a problem for the system. So they've been raising interest rates to provoke a recession. And of course, that's done on the backs of workers. But this inflation is worldwide. And I'm not saying there's a conspiracy to provoke inflation, but I am going to say it's not due to supply-side bottlenecks. It's due to monopoly control over markets. But having said that, inflation can help ameliorate the debt crisis before there are such major defaults that the system collapses, right? That's another issue, but I just wanted to throw that out while you're talking about the debt and the way that capital and the political elite take advantage of the debt to heighten their control and profit making.
Sorry, I was muted. Steve Knight is next.
Well, thanks, Professor Robinson, for your presentation. Very good. And I'm really enjoying your book. I'm about halfway through it, but I'm really enjoying it. I mean, you mentioned different topics that I read about here and there, but I really love how your thinking brings together all these issues. I can see it more holistically now than I could before. So I really do appreciate that. I would just ask, kind of touching on your emphasis on the absolute mandate of capitalism for continuous growth. One of the books that we're reading in the eco-socialist study group here at Marxist Ed Project this fall is The Future is Degrowth. And because we're talking about the degrowth movements, the way it's trying to challenge the growth paradigm. I just wondered, in light of all the other factors that you mentioned here about the worldwide crisis of capitalism, do you see any kind of future at all for a degrowth movement that can challenge that growth paradigm?
Yeah, that's fantastic question and incredibly important. So here's the thing. That leads to a broader story here, right? And then hopefully this will open up to even more interesting debate here. The broader story of our strategy on the left, on the socialist left, do we fight for reforms or do we fight for revolution? And of course, that's a false question because we fight for both. Any and every reform that helps the masses, that improves the situation or allows masses of people to survive, whether it's minimum wages, whatever it is, whether it's universal health care, it doesn't matter what it is. We fight for any reform that helps and strengthen and help survive the mass of working and poor people around the world. And that includes the environmental movement. We have to reform by cutting back on carbon, by, like it or not, we have to cut back on the global industrial agriculture and the industrial animal industry, because that's similarly bringing doom, ecological doom. But anyway, all of those reforms within capitalism are urgent to fight for them. So that's not in contradiction with fighting for revolution, right, against capital. But here's the thing. You can't have degrowth within capitalism. We can have some minor little victories in which we force some changes here and there. For instance, we can force some sectors of the economy to go public once again. They've been privatized, go back to public, and then you have a logic of a public enterprise, which is to meet social needs rather than accumulate private capital. But you cannot have capital degrowth. That is a contradiction in terms. That's an oxymoron. The very, very nature, what makes capitalism is constant, what we call technically expanded reproduction. I'm an investor. I have $100 million. I throw it out as investments. I have to get back 107 million, 110 million, whatever the profit rate is. Then I have to take the 110 million, which represents expanded reproduction in mainstream economic terms. That was growth. Right? And I throw out 110 million, and it has to come back as 120, 127 million. And capitalism constantly has to have expanded reproduction, expanded growth. Otherwise, it collapses. So the capitalist class doesn't have an option. It's not like they're acting irrationally. So if we want to resolve, now this is a very harsh statement to say, because I've spoken with a lot of my colleagues in academia. Colleagues are liberal, generally. I mean, some of us, of course, are radical and socialists and Marxists, but generally U.S. academia is dominated by liberals who are good-hearted and like reform. And they constantly tell me, why are you being so radical? There's what is called circular. So the waste of one industry goes back to feed another industry. And they're saying, you don't need to overthrow capitalism. You can resolve the ecological crisis, but you cannot, because in the long run, capitalism has to grow or collapse, which is why I'm saying by the 21st, we won't make it to the 22nd century, because either capitalism will have collapsed, but it will have destroyed the environment and brought about the sixth mass extinction, et cetera, in such a way that all of humanity goes down. So yes, the degrowth discussion is urgent. If we're able to overthrow this system, we don't need more growth. We need redistribution and new types of community and popular control over popular economies, which doesn't involve growth. It involves a transition to producing things we really need and meeting everyone's basic needs. So yes, degrowth, absolutely, but let's not fool ourselves that we can achieve degrowth and save ourselves from biospheric collapse within global capitalism. We cannot.
Okay, who else would like to join the conversation? I'm looking over my own notes here too, thinking about this.
If you guys are formulating questions, I can say a couple other things, some things I didn't get to. Except, what do you
I think that would be fine.
Okay. So when I researched the book, I was shocked to discover the exponential growth of the new digital technologies. I mean, they blew me away. And just to give you an example, because again, part of the argument here is that digitalization is driving a new radical restructuring of the global economy and society in ways we can barely just starting to wrap our minds around. And so the so-called sharing economy, it jumped from being valued at $14 billion in 2014 to $335 billion estimated by 2025. Worldwide shipments of 3D printing. Again, 3D printing is that it just literally prints you something which normally would be produced by human beings in a factory. And 3D printing has already printed bridges. That's why I was saying construction workers theoretically could become redundant. Like a 3D printing machine printed a bridge in Denmark, right? You feed it the raw material, the machine prints and constructs the bridge. So you have a handful of workers rather than 50, 100, 200 workers making a bridge. So worldwide shipments of 3D printers jumped from 450,000 in 2016 to nearly 7 million by the end of 2020, and it's growing and growing. The global value of e-commerce reached $30 trillion in 2017. By 2019, global internet traffic was 66 times greater than it was in 2005. And here's a dramatic piece of data. Global internet protocol traffic. Now, that's simply a proxy for data flows around the world. Grew from, listen to this, 100 gigabytes per day in 1992 to more than 45,000 gigabytes per second in 2017, and is expected to skyrocket to 150 gigabytes per second by the end of this year that we're in right now, right? And so only in the year 2000, only 1/4 of the world's stored information was digitalized. By 2013, just 13 years later, only 2% of the world's information was not digitalized. So we are in the early days of this data-driven economy, just beginning. So we can imagine the radical restructuring changes this is bringing about. 5.2 billion people in the world have smartphones. So almost the entire world's population is now online. That has dramatic cultural, psychological, social, political implications.
Sorry, I had to step away for a second because I wanted to pick up the latest issue of New Left Review, and I'm referring to this debate that's been ongoing for a year or so between figures like Robert Brenner, Jody Dean, Yanis Varoufakis, Evgeny Morozov, Cedric Durand, about the notion of techno-feudalism and whether as the capitalist economy has stagnated and these global technological corporations like Facebook and Google and Amazon, who manage their profit making through controlling what McKinsey Marcus called the vectors of accumulation, the pipes and the communications channels and so on, and skimming off rent from vast numbers of transactions by consumers and so on, rather than employing workers in large scale production. So whether that portends some kind of new forms of social control and accumulation that are not classically capitalist, but
Yeah.
I mean, the term feudalism has been applied to it, but I think it's really a misnomer. But I think the phenomena that they point to are certainly real. Just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Absolutely. And I would agree with you completely on the last thing you just said, that it's a big mistake to use the term feudalism because it gives the wrong image, that we're moving to something that's not capitalism. But the phenomenon it's trying to capture is very true, but let's analyze that. The idea here, there's several things going on. The idea is that the idea of rents in mainstream economy, I mean, Marxists can use it too, is that you extract wealth even though you're not the one that actually produced the wealth. So, the idea of rents RENTS, which is part of that debate or part of that language of techno-feudalism, that increasingly capital profits from rents rather than from surplus value extracted from workers in a factory or farm or whatever it is. There's importance to look at that. But you also have state elites. For instance, in Nigeria, I lived there for a year, so I mentioned it, you have this incredible oil wealth. And the oil is exploited by transnational oil corporations, but a section of that oil wealth then is appropriated by political elites, and not necessarily even capitalists, in the form of unbelievable corruption. And so it's called a rentier state, in academic terms, a rentier state, because the whole state is like vampire, like sucking up these rents before the rest of the profits go to the oil companies overseas, right? So what that argument of this techno-feudalism is saying is that increasingly capitalism accumulates capital through rents rather than productive investment. But that is part of capitalism. And you said, Fred, quoting them, not classically capitalist. But that's a mistake. There's no such thing as classically capitalist, because capitalism every single day, every year, every decade, every century is constantly evolving and transforming. The only thing permanent in the universe is change itself, which is why we need to constantly analyze how capitalism is transforming. My whole theory of global capitalism, it's in these 3 trilogy books, but I've been writing about it earlier, since the 1990s, is that capitalism had a radical transformation since the 1970s. So it's not wrong to say that this is not classically capitalism, but it is wrong to say that it's not capitalism. That's how capitalism is evolving. But specifically, I've been talking about financialization. I've been saying even the brilliant Marxist economists can't fully wrap their mind around it. In my most recent book, This Global Police State, I finished it in early 2021. It took 18 months to come out. It just came out this past June because of the COVID, right? The printers were closed. But I wrote a year later a book which came out extremely quickly. It's my most recent one, called Can Global Capitalism Endure? Very tiny. And it's more a focus on that large-term question that we won't make it to the 22nd century. Either we'll overthrow capitalism or it will destroy all of us. That's this tiny book. And there I engage, without using the language of techno-feudalism, with that argument. And my argument there is what financialization has meant is that transnational finance capital that can zip around the world in a nanosecond because of the integration of all national financial systems, and because it's fully computerized, right? Finance can zip around the world and grab value where it's produced and shift it elsewhere. So it looks like techno-feudalism, but that's a very bad term. What I mean by that is that traditionally you had, for instance, say 50, 60, 70 years ago, an automobile factory. The owners are industrial capitalists. They produce the car. Some of the value, surplus value they get from labor, it goes to the banks because the bank gave them money to finance the production of the car, right? Some of it goes to the retail sellers, the dealerships which sell the car, and the bulk of it stays with the industrial capitalists, with GM or Ford. That is not classical capitalism, that's just the previous capitalism. Now what can happen is that value is produced somewhere in the real economy, goods or services, but finance, which is frictionless and moves around the world, zips up, grabs it, shifts it into anything else, whether it's into financial speculation, into some new investment, into buying stocks in another country, whatever it is. So you have this new ways in which value is produced, digitally driven production of values, the new ways in which it circulates around the world, and the new ways in which it's appropriated by finance capital itself. And that's what's happening. And that hasn't gotten into this debate. And again, I have a middle section. It's the only really technical section in that brand new book, Can Global Capitalism Endure? The middle section where I'm trying to theorize that and even document it. And the documentation I gave in that one little section is the example of Apple. I don't know how many of, those of you listening are familiar with some of these debates in world systems theory and global commodity change theory. But the argument here is that Apple, which is based in, I think it's based in Silicon Valley, right? Apple makes all of this profit, but it doesn't produce any iPads and iPhones. Now that's true, right? Where does the profit come from? It comes from workers in China, workers in Vietnam, workers all over the world, workers that then sell the Apple in Apple stores, right? So all of this value of the actual workers is transferred to Apple, which produces nothing. It only controls the global production of Apple products. And so my colleagues in world systems and dependency theory, that's an older round of theories, said, well, Apple, is located in the United States, so it's the U.S. hegemony, U.S. capitalist hegemony. That's nonsense. They're confusing things. And that Apple gets all the profits. But when I started to research who owns Apple, you might say Tim Cook. You might say these individual investors. Steve Jobs owned it. But I discovered the biggest owners of Apple itself are the global financial conglomerates. And those global financial conglomerates include the state fund in Saudi Arabia and Chinese private and state interests have the biggest chunks of Apple. So the money that goes from Chinese workers to make an iPad goes to Apple headquarters in the United States, but it doesn't stay there. It goes on to global financial investors all over the world. So if you want to call that techno-feudalism, you can. But for me, it's simply this new evolving stage of global financialized, digitalized capitalism that I'm just trying myself to analyze. And we're beginning to make out the contours of what this all means. I don't know if that helps or if that's too much detail.
No, I think that helps a lot. It was, I mean, this segues from what you just said, but I also noticed a week or two ago that the huge proportion of corporate ownership that has accrued to a handful of asset management companies like BlackRock and its counterparts. So that this, the reality, I mean, you can almost, look at the boards of directors of those 4 asset management companies, and there is your transnational capitalist class.
Exactly. Yeah, on that, I didn't come up with this data. Peter Phillips wrote a great book, Giants, right? The Global Power Elite. Fantastic book. He shares with me the same analysis of global capitalism as this new stage involving a transnational capitalist class. But he identified just 17 global financial conglomerates that manage $41.1 trillion, which is more than half of the entire global economy. 17 global financial conglomerates. BlackRock is one of them. There's 16 others. Have controlled more than half of the entire global economy. Right? So we've never seen such a concentration and centralization of capital on a world scale in the entire history. So that's why we're in a new ball game here.
What was the book, if you know?
Giants. Giants, the Global Power Elite. And you might want to wait because he's updating it. In a few months, I think the new edition will come out and you'll get some updated data. Peter Phillips.
Who else would like to say a few words, pose a question, make a comment? Well, Steve Knight, go ahead.
Just a quick observation. I see that the foreword to your book, Can Global Capitalism Endure, was written by Jason W. Moore. Very interesting, because he was the most recent guest, wasn't he, Fred, on this series?
2 weeks ago.
Just a couple of weeks ago. So if I don't know if you want to, but you may want to talk a little bit about how your thinking and Professor Moore's thinking have kind of enriched each other, maybe if you want to.
Sure. Yeah, well, I have a tremendous amount of appreciation and respect for him and his work, and some of you might know that he coined the term Capitalism. And so there's this debate among the Marxist ecologists. I'll tell you my position on it, but I'm not a specialist in ecology. I do discuss it in the new book. It's the first time I seriously tried to engage with how the ecological crisis fits into all of this in that Can Global Capitalism Endure book. But so the Anthropocene is the term that most people use. And he has a problem with that, Jason Moore, because it suggests that the problem is human beings rather than the problem being capitalism. So he came up with this other term, Capitalocene. And unfortunately, there's just too much sectarian debate on left intellectuals and activists. We should be, as a big family, discussing all of this and debating it. So that debate continues. It became acrimonious among the ecological Marxists. But I think he's right. I think that Capitalocene is better because the contradiction isn't between our species and nature. The contradiction is between our species in capitalism and nature. Now, having said that, we do know that earlier civilizations collapsed because they couldn't reconcile themselves with the reproduction of their own natural environment. The Sumerian civilization, the first one that we know that was full-blown, they oversalinated the soil in what's today Iraq, and they collapsed. The Easter Island civilization, the Mayan civilizations. So that's true that there's this contradiction, but if you look at the contradiction between human beings and nature, it's been in class societies and empires. So the same forces that bring about class domination and class exploitation have also brought about a contradiction between human beings and nature, and that reaches its maximum expression between capitalism and nature. And so, that's what Jason is getting at with his, it's a deep theorist. The other thing is, more than me, Jason has this unbelievably, theoretical and analytical mind. It's fascinating to read his articles. It's hard to read his book. His book is too technical, his massive book. But, you read his articles, they're really exciting. So yeah, that's been a fantastic collaboration. I've learned a lot from him. I think he's warmed up to my theory of global capitalism by learning from me and writing that prologue.
Yeah, Steve and I have led two 8 or 10 week reading groups on capitalism and the web of life, and
yeah,
definitely challenging. But if you take it slow and discuss it along the way, it's quite rewarding.
Indeed.
Okay, any further contributions? William, thanks so much for joining us. We're looking forward to your next 3 or 4 books, but you've gotten us started, I think. It's a very good conversation. We'll looking forward to another opportunity to continue it.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good afternoon.
Take care, everyone.